Caroline is an urban social anthropologist and social policy specialist with over 30 years' experience in urban development and social policy. Originally from South Africa, she undertook her studies in Britain and based her PhD research in Bogotá, Colombia, and also undertook her postdoc longitudinal research in Guayaquil, Ecuador. As a researcher, she has focused primarily on urban poverty, the informal sector, urban violence, asset vulnerability and strategies for accumulation in the urban setting. She joined the DPU in 1978, heading the Masters in Social Development Planning, and also created the Gender Policy and Planning course. She is now Emeritus Professor at the University of Manchester.
I'm an urban anthropologist, and I actually was brought up in Cape Town in South Africa, and I think that's what really sort of influenced me, because obviously it was under an apartheid regime, and my parents were liberals, and I became very interested in urban anthropology, and was particularly influenced by an anthropologist, a very unique woman called Monica Wilson. So I was brought up in South Africa, and then I went to Durham as an undergraduate, and then to Manchester, and then finally I did my PhD at Sussex. So I did all my tertiary education in England.
You then came to the DPU, right, in 1978. So what first attracted you to it?
I always knew I wouldn't become a mainstream academic anthropologist, because I've always been interested in policy. In my PhD, I looked not just at market sellers and how they coped in a situation, and I engaged, which was a very prominent debate at the time, with Oscar Lewis's culture of poverty debate. But what really interested me was the relationship between the market administration and the market sellers. So right from the start, I think I was always interested in, well, what are the policy implications of this? What attracted me about the DPU was that it had this enormous sort of multidisciplinarity, and it was really in the focus at that time, very much, not so much on policy but on planning. And I mean, you know, the development planning unit, and it had these historical links to architecture and planning, and I just was very attracted, and it was urban. And at that point, certainly in Latin America, a real anthropologist, you know, had worked in Amazon and was was influenced by Levi-Strauss and all this sort of stuff. And there was an urban anthropologist, which at that point nobody took seriously. And in a funny way, the DPU was very urban, and there weren't a lot of urban-focused institutions at that time here in England. There really weren't, and certainly not ones that were focused on development and focused on the relationship between, sort of more theoretical issues and planning practice. So that's what attracted me to it, yeah.
In relation to the debates at the time that you were there, what was the pioneering agenda within social policy and planning?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because, in the 1970s there wasn't really a big social policy debate on development. It was social welfare. So it was a very residual welfarist idea. If you look at the books at that time, they were very much about transferring northern knowledge to the south. It was still a period of coming out of colonialism in many African countries. Latin America didn't have very big social policy agendas. And it's interesting that actually the real agenda for me was gender. And what's fascinating about the gender, the whole agenda around gender, is that my colleagues at DFID, who were ODA as it was then, were equally concerned, and we used gender as the entry point to work on social policy. So social policy came out, and the rethink on social policy, actually much of it came from the debates around gender and gender planning. So for me, the most exciting thing I did at the DPU, and I consider it one of, really a great achievement, was to, together with colleagues, particularly Karen, to invent gender planning, and that's what we did. And not only to invent it, and I always remember, because we invented it as a short course, so that actually in training other people, you set up a dynamic of training of trainers. And so a lot of what you did other people then continued.
Yeah.
And that's the extraordinary thing about the gender planning agenda. And out of that, I sort of started developing this the whole conceptual framework of it.
Could you explain what the framework consisted of?
The conceptual framework was very interesting because what I realised was that in order to be taken seriously, or in order to make this appropriate for planners, we had to have a framework that was very, very simple but delivered very fundamental messages. So the first thing was the identification that women have 3 roles: productive, reproductive and community managing. And there was a remarkable woman called Marianne Schmink, an American woman, who'd done quite a lot of work on women's roles, and she influenced me a lot on that. And then the next issue was around women's needs. So that if that way we have roles, and then because women and men are positioned differently, they also have different needs. And the distinction between practical and strategic needs. And there the work of Maxine Molyneux was also very useful and very helpful. Though I was much more concerned about the planning needs. And afterwards this ensued an enormous debate, and a lot of people changed the strategic ones to strategic interests. But at the time we talked about practical and strategic gender needs. And then the third one was about policy approaches and the distinction between 5 very different policy approaches towards women. So we went through the very, very traditional approaches of women in development through to empowerment and equity and so on. And that was the third issue. So it was a very simple framework. And I trained DFID, all the people in DFID, for about 4 or 5 years. And that was to just get these very resistant men in their suits to realise that if they understood just these 3 simple principles or frameworks and integrated it into their policy work, they could start to take on the issue of gender. Of course, by the 1990s it went further with gender mainstreaming, which was a sort of invention of Beijing, but that was post the work that we were doing. It was just such a useful tool to separate out what women do in their engendered roles around water and housing and the activities around the home and so on, and what are the issues that they need to confront to change the nature of gender relations, whether it is around land titling or around employment rights, around a whole set of other issues. And the strategic needs, or interests as people later called it, are around what are the issues that need to be transformed in order to change the nature of gender relations. And of course this is the very political stuff, and it's the very threatening stuff. And these relate to such issues, for instance, as land titles, changing the nature of land titles, changing the nature of access to employment, anything that's going to structurally change and transform gender relations in society. And I think why it was so popular as a framework was it was seen as politically non-threatening at a time when a lot of the feminists were very threatening. It was something that you could train people in a quite a practical way very fast, and they could then elaborate and develop in their own way. A lot of the feminists critiqued it because they said it was very apolitical. Well, we wanted it to be technical on purpose, because we saw technical as a way of entering the political in a non-conflictive way. More recently I've worked a lot with the women's movement in Colombia, and we've used exactly the same sorts of techniques of looking at how do you use the institutional or the technical to get to the political. And so for me this is always very interesting, almost like I've taken that a lot further in other agendas, in other ways. So I guess that's what the DPU offered, you see, and it's summed up in that I could understand and get to grips with the theoretical debates around gender, and then translate them into planning practice. And I think what the DPU gave me, it helped me develop my skill to do exactly that. And since then I've done it around violence, I've done it around poverty, I've done it around, now most recently, around climate change. How do you take these very complex, analytical, theoretical debates, understand them, but then translate them into policy and planning tools that people can use in practice?
When you left the DPU, you joined the World Bank, right?
I went in 1990 to the World Bank, and I was there for 10 years. What came out of it was that I moved and challenged the institution in a somewhat different way about the way they looked at poverty and the way they looked at poverty in terms of income and consumption. And out of that I developed a whole framework at looking at the assets of the poor and the way the poor accumulate assets and looking at their asset portfolios, which had lots of resonance to my earlier work at the DPU, because the first asset, and I did this very, very in-depth longitudinal work in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and the first asset that households accumulate is housing. What the World Bank taught me was that you have to bring economists in to do the econometrics, otherwise you won't be taken seriously. So it was a very econometric study with surveys and all this sort of stuff. But that allowed me to get beyond the issue of income and consumption poverty, as I was saying, and to develop a whole way of looking at the way the poor, or people coming out of very low income conditions, it's not just one asset, it's a portfolio. So I looked a lot at social capital, which related again back to earlier work in the DPU around community mobilisation, around access to infrastructure, the mobilisation for physical infrastructure, education, and the difference between first and second generations in that case was particularly interesting, and also other physical assets and financial assets and so on. So I shifted, and I guess that's what I did, was to shift from a very sort of two-dimensional look at poverty and others' consumption, but to looking at this very much more complex issue of the portfolio, the asset portfolio of the poor. And I've taken that asset portfolio further, because actually when you look at violence, you look at the way violence erodes assets. I did with another colleague, we did a very big, I've done 4 or 5 studies on Colombia, Guatemala, Jamaica. Most recently just run a very big project out of the University of Manchester on the tipping points of conflict. All of them taking this type of framework. And again on climate change. Climate change is fascinating to look at. Actually not just at the erosion of assets, but the adaptation. How households and individuals and households and communities adapt their assets. Is it housing? Is it the social capital in their community to cope with severe weather and changes in weather?
Highlights of your career? What would you say they were?
Yeah, I thought about this question. It's a very difficult one. I think getting my PhD was absolutely critical. I was a young mother with 2 children at a time where it was very, very difficult to get a job as a woman. Inventing gender planning was one of the highlights, has been one of the highlights of my life. And I think, writing the book relating to it. Another of my achievements, which is much, much later, was that, for 30 years I've been going back and forth to this community in Guayaquil in Ecuador. And the completion of that book, it's a complicated book and it's never going to be a great seller, was a great achievement. And it was interesting that when I wanted to launch it, I decided the place to launch it is the DPU.